Wanted to make a video with tips for trip planning. So everyone trip plans, but there are tips and tricks that I've learned over decades, which really led to a book. Actually, this book that I think can help people, and so I wanted to pass those along. So these are 10 tips for outdoor adventures for trip planning. Okay, tip number 1. I think this is the most fun part. Every adventure starts with a map. This is a map of Prince William Sound, where I've adventured many times, both for work and for fun. You can see my marks from a trip that I planned a few years ago with friends on this map. Working with maps and charts has to become second nature. It's where every trip should start. It's where we will make our overview plan and check feasibility of that plan. We can figure out escape routes for when things go wrong. You should always be collecting maps or charts of places that you want to adventure. So tip number 1, every adventure starts with a map. Tip that I want to talk about is self-care. And to some people that might seem obvious. To a lot of people, you may not really think about it. But self-care, I think, is super important. And it can just be like, hey, making sure you're wearing correct layers and things like that. It's things like making sure you've got sunscreen and lip balm, and like in my front pocket is a buff that I'm about to put on to keep the sun off the back of my neck. Even though it's November and 61 degrees, you can still get a sunburn. It's also thinking about hydration and eating well and all of those things that go along to self-care. And then post-paddle, or whatever it is you're doing in the outdoors, it's getting out of wet clothes and getting into dry clothes and making sure that that you're taking care of yourself and you're well rested and you're well fed. Before, during, and after whatever it is you're doing in the outdoors, you need to be thinking about self-care. It's really easy for me to get rolling quickly and grab all my gear. I don't spend a lot of time obsessing over what am I going to use today, because another tip is build a gear set that you use all the time. So my gear set rarely changes. Almost always I'm using exactly the same gear, particularly through the summer months. It'll change somewhat in the fall when I go to a dry suit, but beyond the dry suit, I generally don't mess with it. All my gear is easy to grab. Everything is, I'm not that organized, but everything is in either a duffel bag or a crate, so it's easy to find. And I'm not scrambling like, hey, where is XYZ? Create a gear set that you use all the time. You won't forget things, you won't misplace things. It works really well. Another tip for like positive growth is to go paddling or hiking or whatever when the weather is bad. Some people say there's no bad weather, just bad gear, and it's true to a degree. On the water, I think you need to be a little bit more careful than on the land. This could get bad really quickly, but going out when the weather is bad will push your skill set a little bit, get you more comfortable, and it makes good trips great. It makes good trips seem epic or feel epic. So I highly recommend going paddling when the weather is not great, or backpacking when the weather is not great. Whatever it is you do, fly fishing, whatever. It'll make you a better outdoors person. The other thing to think about in terms of going when the weather is bad, if you really want to adventure in the outdoors, you're gonna have days where you don't get to choose the weather, where you're like, the weather's not so good, I'll stay home today. If you're out there, you're out there. You need to have your systems dialed in so that you're prepared to deal with a day where it's windy or it's raining or it's snowing, and still get the miles done you have to get done and still be safe about it. And so you can't do that unless you spend time adventuring in the outdoors when the weather is bad. I'd rather do it today when I've got a van that's a half a mile away with a heater and dry clothes than have the first time I paddle or hike in bad weather be on the middle of a 10-day trip. So you got to get out, you got to experience the conditions, and it'll show you what's weak and what needs to be worked on. Another tip for adventurers is I use the phrase, don't latch on to an idea. And essentially what that's saying is, if you are lonely, angry, tired, cold, hungry, don't make a big decision, a big trip ending or altering decision. Fix those problems first. So lonely, angry, tired, cold, hungry is latch. Don't latch onto an idea. Tip number 6, feed the machine. Paul Petzold says that lunch was the meal that started just after breakfast and ended just before dinner. You have to be constantly refueling yourself to keep performing well. So find what works for you. It can be freeze-dried food like these. It can be noodles or ramen, something like that. It can be cheese or sausage or pepperoni, things that are calorie dense. Find things that work for you and keep feeding yourself. If you're not fueled, you're not going to perform well. If you're not performing well, you're going to make mistakes. So tip number 6, keep feeding the machine. Another tip is to push yourself, to be a little bit afraid when you're adventuring, particularly when you're building skills and things like that. And the reason is it builds your ability to handle stress a little bit better when you're adventuring, but also increases your skill set. And so when I bought my first touring kayak, I got in it and paddled it around, and my first thought was, this boat is just way too tippy, and it made me a little nervous. I was like, you know what, in 6 months it won't feel tippy. And I was right. In fact, in 3 months it didn't feel tippy, and what that gave me was an increased level of comfort in a boat that was less stable. So push yourself, be a little bit afraid when you're doing things, and your skill set will continue to improve. I see too many people in the outdoors that just do the same thing all the time. They're never pushing, they're never building skill sets. While it's good that they're outside, they're not getting better at what they do, and I think we all need to be working to get better at what we do. The next tip is when you finish your trip and you get back home and you empty out your pack or your bike or whatever, make 2 piles. And those 2 piles are the gear you used and the gear you didn't use. In the gear you didn't use pile, pull out your rain gear and your first aid kit. Everything else that's in that pile doesn't need to go with you. There are always exceptions. Hey, I didn't use XYZ on this trip, but I generally always use it. But in general, if you don't use it on a trip, you don't need to bring it. So make 2 piles. A pile of stuff you used, a pile of stuff you didn't use, with the exception of rain gear and first aid kit. The stuff you didn't use can stay home next time. Okay, tip number 9 is super important, and almost no one does it. People do it if they work in the outdoor industry because it's part of what we do as outdoor educators. And that thing is debriefing your trip. And so at the end of a class or a paid trip, you always sit down with the other instructors, usually someone else as well who'll help facilitate the process. But you talk about what worked, what didn't work, and things that can happen better the next time. So you can do that too for your trips. If you are adventuring with friends, sit down with them a day or 2 after your trip and talk about what worked, what didn't work, what you can do better the next time. But even if you're adventuring on your own, you can still do it. Sit down with a pad and a pen and think about the things that worked, the things that didn't work, the things you want to change, things that you forgot, gear that didn't work, all that stuff. So debrief your trip after the fact so that you don't make the same mistakes further down the road. And the final tip, tip number 10, this is more important for me as I get older, which is simply you have to train for adventures. Even if you're not an older adventurer like I am, you need to be training. The harder you train before your trip, the better experience you'll have on your trip. For me, as a 52-year-old outdoor educator, I'm realizing, and I pretty much realize this every year, next year I really have to kick it up yet another notch. I work with a personal trainer twice a week. I get a far better workout working with her than I would in the gym on my own, and it takes a lot less time. She focuses me on the things that I need to focus on, as opposed to when you get into the gym, you work on the things you enjoy working on. So I work with her twice a week, and then she gives me homework to do on my own. So things that I'll do if I'm training for a backpacking trip, I'll train with more weight in my pack than I'm going to have in my pack when I'm actually doing the trip. When I'm training for a paddling trip, I'm doing lots of core and rotational stuff. So always train for adventures before your adventure, and it will make your trip so much better and safer, because if you're in better physical shape, you're less likely to have an issue on the trail. So that is 10 trips for outdoor adventurers. If you found these useful, check out my book, Go with an exclamation point, which is on Amazon and Apple Books. And I'll see you outside.